to see you.
Yeah. I mean, how long has it been? It was right after we went to that bar, right?
Went to Aquarius, yeah, my favorite bar there at my house. I still call it my house because I still miss my house in Chicago. Yeah, it was 2014, December 2014.
And man, 2014, time flies, huh?
I know, and we both left around the same time.
Yeah, I left 2016 to come to Vegas, which is I'm not used to living out in the desert, Southwest culture. I mean, we could talk about that. I mean, you're from even when
I would. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I never really consider Nevada as Southwest, but I guess it is.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, southern, especially southern Nevada, right? We're not talking about Carson City and Tahoe here. But I mean, when I took your class, what was it? Spanish for Spanish speakers or Spanish heritage speakers class.
Yes.
We'll get to that because I was really upset about it at the time.
I know, I remember.
Because I was ready to graduate, and then they tell me you have to take this class. I'm like, and plus I'm terrible at Spanish, so like anything. I think
Don't say that. That's not true.
No, I am terrible at Spanish. I'm pretty bad, right? Especially as it was my first language. But you kind of, it's like when you're forced to do a sport in gym that you suck at, and you say you hate the sport, but it's just because you suck at it. You know what I mean? But yeah, when I met you, you were like this proud, and you had taught me this word. You taught the class this word, I think, Nuevo Mexicana. Or neo-Mexicano, or I mean, what's the term?
I say Nuevo Mexicana, but some scholars use the term neo-Mexicano or neo-Mexicana.
And just explain what that is for people because everybody knows Tejano, right? People now know Califa, right? People say that.
California también.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no Mexicano or no Mexicana, I think that a good way to think about that, like you said, a lot of people do know what it means to be Tejano or Tejana. And no Mexicanos, the way that I identify that way is very place-based. It's very much like, we are from here. This isn't really, we didn't have that immigrant experience in that it's anything in a memory that we can remember, near as an immigrant experience. Our families have been in New Mexico since the 1600s. We can trace that and that we have this connection to place that really precedes any national identities of the U.S. or even Mexico, right? Because we were really only part of Mexico as a nation for about 20 some years. And Mexico hadn't established this national identity at that point, really, what we know it as now. So Nuevo Mexicanos have, this regional-based, place-based identity with the place that is Nuevo Mexico, that was Nuevo Mexico from the time that it was, that name was given to that land since the Spanish came through, even before it was, it's a state. And then we have, this identity and this name that preceded, the Mexican nation as well. So there's this real connection to place and also kind of, I use Nuevo Mexicana and I say Chicana as well. My dad was, part of the Chicano movement generation, or a little young, but still part, very influenced by it and having this pride to be something different, right? We're not.
And a lot of people don't know about that. I mean, I remember I wrote something on lowrider culture, and I was talking about how I was from El Paso and LA, and you're like, hey, you wrote me, and you said, hey, you forgot about New Mexico, and
Española, New Mexico, Chimayo, New Mexico, Rio Arriba County, all very connected to lowrider culture, definitely. So we have, all these things that are kind of happening in the Southwest in parallel, maybe happening at the same time, but we don't know about it, right? Because it's happening in different regions. So there's connections there. Like, I don't like to say, oh, well, this is the point of origin of any of it, but, things are happening simultaneously. And then you also have, it's important to remember with the history of the Southwest that when the U.S. did steal, conquest, take over the northern part of Mexico in beginning 1846 and solidifying that in 1848, of the 100,000 Mexicans that were in those areas, 60,000 were in New Mexico. So that there is this population, I guess, density, if you can say that, because New Mexico doesn't have a lot of population density. But at that time, there's a reason why kind of a Nuevo Mexicano identity kind of evolved a little differently.
Yeah, like New Mexico is one of the I was going to say outside of Florida, right? Because everybody knows about St. Augustine, but outside of Florida, it's the oldest, especially continually habited place where, former Spanish colonists now live, right? I mean, New Mexico is that's where the Camino Real ended in Santa Fe, right? And I've been to Santa Fe.
Zacatecas to Santa Fe.
Oh, really? We did a road trip from Chicago to Denver.
Yes, I saw that.
Instead of going, people usually go from Denver through Utah, right? Because that's the shortest way to get to Vegas. But I was like, when am I going to pass through here, especially driving? And so we just came down, through Colorado Springs, Puebla, and all that stuff. Or Pueblo. Raton and Cimarron Canyon and all that stuff, and Eagle's Nest Lake and all the. I saw my first prairie dogs. It's a whole city. It's like more prairie dogs than people in that place. Eagle's Nest Lake. But Santa Fe. I mean, you go there and it's. Especially in Chicago, in the United States, it feels really old. You especially go to the church, right? You go to the square and everything seems like, I've been to Honduras, I've been to Mexico. It seems like you're in Honduras or Mexico, right?
Exactly. It's an extension of, of these Spanish colonial cities of Latin America, really. It's very much that feel. There's this sense that, we're so different, we're so old, but I mean, we're just connected to the other old colonial cities that were part of, the conquest of the Spanish coming this way. So you have definitely those connections, because even when I used to do my programs with my heritage students to Nicaragua, my students from Nuevo Mexico would be like, Granada, Nicaragua feels like home. It's like, there's a reason for that. We have these connections there that I think those who come to Santa Fe, from the outside, who aren't Latino, who are, Anglo.
And there's a lot of that, right? I mean, especially that market. There was an outdoor market, and the let's say the Anglos, they love it, right? Because it's like you're like
exoticizing kind of indigenous culture, sometimes Hispanic culture, but definitely indigenous culture. I mean, and there's that kind of. I never understood the term gentrification when I was growing up, because when I did come to understand it from living in DC and living in Chicago, it was very much an urban phenomenon. But then I realized, wait, this is what's been happening in Santa Fe for a really long time already, right?
Wow.
It just takes on a different. I mean, we don't call it. I didn't grow up calling it that, but I knew that somehow.
Because it's not techies, it's not like yuppies. It's a different kind of gentrification.
Yeah, and it's this these parts of Santa Fe that my family was from that no longer, I mean, we do still have my great grandma's house, which is pretty close to the plaza. My uncle and aunt had purchased that, but we have, these parts of town that were where we were from are no longer affordable for people who are from there, and you understand that from Chicago for sure, right?
Yeah, we had brunch at the Plaza Cafe. And I still, me antoja those Pinyon Pancakes.
Oh, those sound good. And, we had a good Pinyon crop too this year, so there's a lot of Pinyon around.
I love that you know what the crop was in New Mexico, the Pinyon crop.
Look, I actually had been there. I'd been home for, I was on a research fellowship.
New Mexicans are proud of that, right? In the chilies and in the Pinyon nuts, right? I mean, you guys are proud of the land and what it provides, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting because my partner is originally from Guanajuato, but raised in Chicago since he was 5, and he.
My suegro's from Guanajuato, yeah.
Is he? I don't know why I thought they were from Juarez.
Well, he moved to Juarez when he was a kid, but he was born in Guanajuato. My wife's from Juarez.
From Juarez, that's right. Yes, Rocio came that time when we were at Aquarius. Yeah. He's always like, you guys, you're very much like us, even though you think you're not. Like, well, it's not that I don't think we are. I just think that we don't have a way to talk about those connections.
Wow.
And the Chile is one important example, right? Because we grew up only knowing our Chile from New Mexico, right? Like it's red or green, it's the same plant. We know, but when you think about all the different types of chiles there are in Mexico, and being in Chicago and me making things with my green chili, I'm still part of a quilting group through the Mexican Museum called Puntas del Alma. It's a lot of older ladies. Because I still go to Chicago before the pandemic. I was going pretty much every 6 weeks or so. So I was still keeping those connections. But I would always, we always cook stuff, and I'd bring things with my green chili, and they'd be like, "What kind of chile is it?" And I was like, "I don't know. We just call it chile because it's the only chile that we use in New Mexico for everything." right? And I know now it's kind of Anaheim, Chile, and yes, it's grown mostly in New Mexico, but yes, we're very proud of that, and it's part of our it's part of our year, right? The rhythm of the year. You know what time of year you're going to smell the chili roasting, and then everybody's going to be peeling. We still get together every day, Labor Day weekend, and we always did an assembly line type chili peeling thing on my mom's side of the family, with my Sanchez side of the family, and getting it all ready so that we have our freezer stocked for the year.
I mean, just the way you're describing this, like, life in New Mexico. Do me a favor, move your screen a little bit down so we can get
down.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
And just the way you're describing it, I mean, you make it sound like you lived in Latin America, right? I mean, this is kind of like an ancient way of life. It's beautiful, right? But it's an ancient way of life, especially for a kid who was born and raised in Chicago. I don't remember, the chilies roasting every summer and stuff like that. I don't have memories like that. But I will say that when I went to New Mexico and I had heard about the chilies before, it's another thing, right? Especially with pork bellies and the chili sauce. And it's weird how traveling, you get to see, like, oh, what people talk about a place, oh, that's really real. It's actually more than how they describe it. Like, you can't describe it. You have to just go there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's...
How was it like growing up in Albuquerque? I mean, we didn't stop in Albuquerque because it looked kind of dead. I like Santa Fe. We stayed in Santa Fe. But, I mean, what was it like growing up in Albuquerque? I mean, especially since you've lived in D.C. and Chicago, so now you have, like, a reference point to...
Right. I mean... I also talk about this with my partner a lot of times too, because I feel like you said it looked a little dead. I think it's important to adjust the mindset to what a Western city feels like, as opposed to right? a more dense urban center like Chicago. And even Chicago's doesn't to me never felt as dense as places like New York and things like that, right? Because it felt much more like, oh, okay, I can do this. This feels very, very
yeah. It's not like New York. New York's too much. I mean, you gotta, and that's why people from New York are just 100%, right? Like, I feel like Chicago's about 85, 90%, like, we go hard, but we like to have fun.
And it felt very drivable to me. And like, I can navigate the city really easily like that, and everything. But, Albuquerque, I feel like it's what's legible to you and what's not, right? So this, my partner always tells me, like, oh, it looks very suburban. Like, well, but that's creating this dichotomy between urban and suburban, and cities look different in different places, right? So just because it looks suburban doesn't mean that, oh, it's not, it doesn't have some challenges here. This isn't quote unquote a rougher area or more challenged area.
Right.
So I mean, Albuquerque, I always knew it was the biggest city in New Mexico, and I'm born and raised in Albuquerque. My mom was from the South Valley of Albuquerque, but all my grandparents are actually not originally from Albuquerque. My grandparents who raised my mom's side of the family in Albuquerque are from Belen, New Mexico, which is just a little south of Albuquerque, and from Pueblitos, which is just a little south of Belen. And then my dad's side's all from Santa Fe and Taos and from further north. So I love Albuquerque, but I don't have those deep roots in it like other families may have. I think I introduced you to my friend Eric Garcia. He's an artist. He does the El Machete Illustrated, and he does a lot of the political cartoons.
I mean, we'll get into that because you really, I mean, I took your class in it was the summer.
It was the summer class.
I graduated that summer, and you were asking me. We went, first of all, you took us to the El Faro, which is like a vegan Mexican restaurant in Little Village.
Mm-hmm.
And we were coming back, and you were, asking everybody what their plans were to do, And I'm like, oh, I had been writing for the school paper, and I'm like, oh, I want to write for somebody. And you're like, you should write for this website called Gozamos. I had never heard of them, right? And I was like, oh, I want to get into more Latino writing because I don't really write about Latino writing. And they're like, oh, well, you should, write for this thing called Gozamos. And I started writing for them that fall. This is October 2011. I know the month, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It was 2011? I cannot believe these things.
Yeah.
Time goes so fast.
And the rest is history, right? I mean, I became a editor there. I got really involved with the art scene in Pilsen, and now, Latino Rebels. And, there's a direct line from you saying that to this podcast, really. Because I did a podcast at Gozamos, too. And that kind of put me on to this whole idea of, like, podcasting. But what was I going to say?
Where were we before that? We were talking about... This is our conversations. This is us having breakfast at Café con Leche and just talking for hours.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about, right? Like, because the one thing let's get into this whole.
Oh, you asked me about Albuquerque. That's what it was.
Yeah. Let's get into this whole thing about you. I mean, you're really big into Spanish for heritage speakers, right? Talk about this program. People don't. I mean, a lot of people I know don't know about that, right?
Right. So Spanish as a heritage language programs have actually been around in universities for a while, particularly in New Mexico and actually in Arizona, where I am now.
Did it start with the Chicano movement, kind of like?
Yes, and I don't think we have enough documentation of that. But I mean, this whole resurgence of, well, who are we? In the 60s, and we were promised these things through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we're not really getting no están cumpliendo, right? We're not getting
as in like
the fruits of these promises.
I mean, that treaty makes it so that you don't have to speak English to become a citizen, right? Because it just gave everybody living there citizenship, supposedly.
Supposedly, it didn't specifically say you don't have to speak English to be a citizen, but it said we'll respect your religion, your culture, things like that. And New Mexico took that to heart, in that we didn't have any like English only provisions in the Constitution. In fact, we had like a bilingual Constitution that a state
the only one, right?
At the time,
statehood,
right? And we were also denied statehood for a really long time because of the density of Mexicans. There were other words used, but the fact that the U.S. wanted the land but didn't want the people in it, right? So. And there were a lot of people, exactly. And those are actually parallels between Puerto Rico and New Mexico that I love to make, and that I didn't discover till my time in DC, when I lived there in 2001 through 2002. And then I went back again in 2004 and 5. Those colonial connections are so important. And it's not only the history that, we had to wait 60 some years to become a state, and Puerto Rico is still waiting whether or not, that's a good idea to become a state at this point or not. That's other political discussions with Puerto Rico, but the idea of this long wait, these arguments that are made against Puerto Rican statehood are very similar to the arguments made against New Mexico becoming a state. And then mapping the linguistic insecurity of the ways that your language is taken from you, the ways that you experience linguistic oppression, very similar. And I felt so connected to that with all the first time I kind of lived and worked with a lot of Puerto Ricans, both from the island and from the U.S., from the mainland, when I lived in D.C. And then of course, I feel like that's why I was very drawn to, Puerto Rican communities in Chicago as well, because we have those colonial connections in ways that I think we don't even realize. So Spanish as a heritage language programs came about because of this consciousness of, wait, we need to serve this population differently. These individuals have different connections to the language than Spanish people who are coming at Spanish from a completely foreign second language perspective, and don't have these pieces that are kind of with you. My dad was part of Spanish as a heritage language program in the 1970s at the University of New Mexico, and he was identified as needing to be in the program because some words he was using were very like, oh, you must be from northern New Mexico, there's a class for you, kind of thing.
Like what? Like what kind of words would we know that are?
No, he just said in northern New Mexico you say media for socks instead of calcetines, and that like kind of, a lot of the teachers are from Latin America and from Mexico or from Spain or Anglo, right? So that just certain lexical terms will mark you as, the same way that there are different terms between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. And
well, like my mom's side is Honduran.
Exactly.
And we say nevera for refrigerator, right? But if you talk to like Mexican people, they say refri or stuff like that. I mean, but I mean, the thing I appreciate about it is that, yeah, when I was in high school and I took Spanish 1, Spanish 2, I took Spanish all the way to 4, right? I think I might have failed Spanish 4, but you learn the vosotros, you learn things that people don't use in Latino culture, right? We know that's from Spain, right? But nobody talks like that. And I remember Latinos taking Spanish and thinking like, this is bullshit. So I appreciate that there's a Spanish program for Latinos. I mean, Spanish heritage speakers. We're talking about Latinos,
basically,
right?
What it is, Spanish for Latinos, right? I mean, yeah. that's what it is.
That's interesting that it can't be called that, right? I mean, in a way, it can't be called that, right?
The terminology is interesting, right? So, I mean, there's been a whole trajectory with the terminology for what do we call these classes, right? Mm-hmm. I think the first wave, they were Spanish for native speakers, Spanish for bilinguals. Even at UIC, the official term is still Spanish for bilinguals, I believe. which actually I've always preferred Spanish as a heritage language or Spanish for heritage learners, because many of us grew up not feeling comfortable speaking, right? So we don't consider ourselves speakers, but
Exactly.
we are receptive, right? We had to, it's a process to become comfortable with hearing your own voice and reclaiming that voice in Spanish, but we're exposed to it. We have a relationship to it that's very different from somebody who doesn't have the family and community connections to the language. So there's that aspect of it. Actually, my mentor at UIC, my gran mentora and friend, Frances Aparicio, she started heritage classes in the 1980s at Harvard, and she did call them Spanish for Latinos. So there's, particularly I remember having this discussion at UIC with, how our students placed in our classes, because I was used to in New Mexico, if you identify with Spanish as part of your background, you're in the heritage program. We had multiple levels. We had beginning levels, those who didn't feel comfortable speaking, all the way to advanced levels.
I remember that. I mean, to get into to be placed, I had to take a test. And I mean, first of all, the test and your class was probably the hardest thing I did, at UIC, right? I mean, I took, I graduated with history. I did my thesis and all that stuff. Your class was so hard because you would,
really?
Yeah, because you would make us read. I remember there was something. It was all about internet, right, and then social media, and so
digital divide and things like that.
You're learning word that I knew that you would teach us words that you would say oh, Latinos say this. They say, I mean, I can't even. I'm not that good.
Yeah.
You would say most people say this, but that's not actually the right way to say it. You have to say it like this. And Latinos, proud Latinos in your class would be like, oh wow, we would open our eyes to it. I think that's what it was. We're not confident in the language, right? We're not strong in the language, and the words that we were taught were Spanglish, and so it's a crutch. And so you have this crop of kids who have this crutch, and so your job is to take away the crutch and watch. They're limping for a while, and then they learn to use the language properly. But it's really hard when you've learned those crutches.
Okay, but I don't think I ever said proper or correct because because that I think part of what our job is in heritage classes is to actually not do that and to say, listen, you have a lot of resources and you have this bilingualism that you're not even recognizing.
Yeah.
But there are, let's give you options. Let's make sure that you are able, in the same way that you want to be able to dialogue in academic circles in English. Let's say, okay, this is another word you could use, but it's never about replacing what you have from home, replacing the Spanglish, because why would you want to take away modes of communication that are valid in a community, right? And then you no longer have the connection to that community. And then it's somehow saying, well, the way that my community or my family speaks is somehow not correct. So I know we definitely emphasize to kind of widen the options, but never to replace what you bring from home, right? Or to disparage what you have from home or what you have from your community.
Well, based on what you're saying about how, modes of communication.
That's the history in New Mexico, right? Of being disparaged for the way we speak and the way that, the variations that we speak. And even the research that I did for my dissertation and my book project now is very much about hierarchies around language, exactly with what you were mentioning with different words, between Mexicanos from Mexico who are immigrants in New Mexico and those who are from New Mexico for generations and generations. Those hierarchies between language choice, between what are these ideologies around the correct way of speaking and the non-correct way of speaking? Me knowing from my sociolinguistics background that there is no correct or incorrect, there's just different. And that's the type of way that I like to approach the heritage classes, and that most scholars agree we should be approaching them. But getting back to the terminology of saying, oh, Spanish for Latinos, I mean, there's this way of talking about heritage classes that is kind of very much divorced from Chicano studies and Latino studies when it shouldn't be. There's also a way that you can, of course, argue that there are people who don't have the cultural or ethnic identity with being Latino or Chicano or Hispano that may have been exposed to the language from a young age. I get students who have nanas and babysitters who are right. Spanish speakers, and so they grow up with that exposure to the language, or those who maybe did mission trips in Latin America. So
Right.
it's not supposed to be exclusive in a ethnic cultural way, but I actually think that's part of what makes them beautiful, is that you have that solidarity, you have that small feeling of home in a larger university, or in a place that maybe it's not large, but it's not familiar for you, because we don't have a lot of intergenerational higher education in our community. So it definitely is Spanish for Chicanos, Spanish for Latinos. I think there was an argument at UIC that we couldn't call it that, or have students who are just simply identify as being Latino being in the classes, because it needed to have a linguistic profile of some sort, or linguistic placement, something that showed linguistically that you belonged in this class. But I mean, the way that I approach the classes in Arizona, in New Mexico, and if I were directing a program in Chicago, would be, if you identify with the language and you have this connection, then you have a right to be taught it in a context that validates your connection to it, that so you can understand your history with the language, how we've been dispossessed from our language in the US, how English is this English monolingualism is a pervasive ideology, and bilingualism is only awarded when it's something added on later and not something trying to be maintained from the beginning. So you have to contextualize the language learning in that environment, and that's what the heritage classes do, no matter what level you're at. And of course, the idea is that, yes, you feel confident in your academic capacities in Spanish, but we have to always question the varieties that we're using. Why are we using them? Who's saying that this is proper? Who's saying that this is correct?
I mean, there's a lot of, you touched on a lot of things there. I mean, one, you'll be happy to know that since, graduating your class, well, the one thing that was good about your class is that it puts together Latino kids who are in the same boat. Yes. Right? Like, we're Latinos, but we're not comfortable with Spanish. And that's an insecurity among Latinos, right? Like, you'll be around a Latino or Latina and they're really good Spanish. And you're like, oh, I'm not that kind of Latino, and you feel bad, you're like, I am Latino, but I'm just not. Latino's weird, right? Latino culture is weird because it's the only thing where like Spanish is a major part of it, but everybody in it, in the community, quote unquote, has wide varying degrees of relationship to that language. From none at all to very fluent. And so it's weird.
What I like to tell the students, like obviously, your cultural ethnic identity is not based on language proficiency, but it is the connection to Spanish is there, whether or not you feel proficient in it or not. The fact that you don't feel like you're enough already connects names, you, right? Connects you in a way. Yeah. I mean, we have the last names, although my last name is not, my last name is Irish, but that also speaks to the ways that different groups came in New Mexico. And
shout out to Marlena Fitzpatrick, my friend and business partner. She's Puerto Rican Irish, Marlena Fitzpatrick.
Well, that's kind of interesting. In New Mexico, we have a lot of French and Irish and German last names that came about because of those, small families, small groups of families moving in the 1800s. But because the majority of the population was, ethnic Mexican, was Hispanic in New Mexico, that they become part of that culture. And, we get to the point where we have these last names that we all know we're Chicano, but the last names, in New Mexico, we know that those are Chicano families, but outside of that, we don't. But getting back to the to the ways that you're talking about, oh wow, I totally forgot what that connection was.
About how like Latino
is the linguistic insecurity and the ways that the classroom provides that space, because we're so isolated. We think, well, this is my experience. I'm the only one going through this. It was my family who decided to not teach it to me, or I'm the one who has the problem because I don't feel confident. So we're able to look at that history and say, actually, no, that's part of a larger project of that's systemic, that's institutional, that's been a part of this country since its inception. So this actually is not about blaming. That's what would happen in my mom's family, my mom's side of the family. My mom would be upset with my grandparents for saying, well, you didn't teach it to us. And my grandparents, well, you didn't want to learn. And, but that's all in the context of a school system that's not valuing it to begin with, a society that's not valuing it. But when you have these situations where you're all brought together and you are able to say, okay, I may not feel like I have much capacity in this language, but I have a relationship to it.
Yeah.
And that's like, and the relationship can be that I'm not enough.
You're estranged.
I'm estranged from it, right?
Yeah.
But it's still, that's something that you bring that somebody, who just decides, oh, I'm going to take Spanish for my language requirement, wouldn't bring that into the classroom. And that's important. It goes so much
To them, it's completely exotic, right? An Amber or an Ashley learning Spanish is like, "Cómo estás?" and they love it, because they're thinking of Spain. But when we hear Spanish, we're thinking of the motherland, right? We're thinking of where our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents came from.
Or we're thinking of Little Village or Logan Square and the street corner. Like we're thinking of our U.S. communities that are also Latino homes that we have. So I think also the way that Spanish language education has worked, both in heritage programs and outside of heritage programs, is that these classes are centered on looking outward. Oh, well, Spanish exists there, or Spanish, that's where that's the standard that we're looking at. And what should happen in every heritage class, and also because we, by some estimates, are the third, some estimates the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world.
I was going to say, I always say on the show that the United States is becoming a Latin American country.
Exactly. I mean, we are one of the largest Spanish-speaking countries. So if that's the case, why aren't we centering everything here first? Like, why are we looking to, which is fine to look at Mexico and Spain for some things, but why aren't we starting with looking at where we're at? And that's what we do in our program here. That's what I've done. That's why I like us to be centered in Chicago. Like, why aren't we looking at Humboldt Park? Why aren't we looking at Little Village? Why aren't we looking at the suburbs now that, because people the data had showed us for a while that people weren't moving directly into these communities like Little Village or
they moved to the suburbs now, right?
They were moved directly to the suburbs, right? Yeah, because
my wife's family went straight to North Lake, a suburb. My family kind of went straight to the suburbs, really, too. And it's the suburbs. I know, especially right on the edge of the cities, right? Those suburbs are like becoming what enclaves used to be, yes. Right? What Pilsen used to be.
And I think it's important to look at those kind of the ways that. Also, what I think is important in Spanish as a heritage language class, you may have communities that have moved, directly to the suburbs, moved to Wheeling. They don't understand the heritage that is part of their heritage being now in Chicago and understanding the fights that happened in Pilsen with the Chicana movement, right. And the ways that the Young Lords and the Brown Berets worked together and came together even in Chicago to understand that heritage. And then to also understand, and we have a stake in this heritage of the Chicana movement in the Southwest too, because if it wouldn't have been for that, we wouldn't be where we are now. So making those connections that even though we don't have, some communities may not have a long presence in a certain area, kind of by being Latino, by being now a Latino living in the U.S., you now have this other heritage of the Chicana movement, of the Young Lords movement, of what's happened with immigrant rights movements, what's happened with DACA. All that is part of our kind of our shared history that even though your family may not even have been here in the 60s, now you're part of this and you can get to learn what that was and how we can now continue it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really, aside from language, like that's a really important part of the heritage classes.
Yeah. I mean, now you talking about your program, now I'm completely behind it. The reason I was mad, well, like I said, I was about to graduate too. My high school, they didn't allow Spanish in the halls during passing period, because you might be offending, or you were just essentially fundamentally like you were to speak Spanish in front of non-Spanish speakers was to insult them. They felt uncomfortable because they didn't know what you were saying about them. I mean, this law, it felt like a law. You're a kid, right? This rule wasn't for Polish. There's a lot of Polish immigrant kids, Russian immigrant kids. Yeah. It was just Spanish. And I remember it was on the PA and everything. And so, I mean, by then I didn't know my Spanish was terrible, but it just reinforced. Okay, this is the system telling me not to learn Spanish. Okay, and I became a writer. Now I'm really geary with English, and so now I'm about to graduate, and they're like, no, you need to know Spanish. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
But I agree. But then,
that's even what Julian Castro had said, right? When he was being kind of critiqued for, well, why don't you speak Spanish better? Or why can't? And he's like, whoa, you're telling me now I need to speak Spanish when my grandparents were told not to? And, this double standard and not understanding this long history of linguistic dispossession. And then, okay, now I'm supposed to know it, but you deprived me from knowing it institutionally and systemically.
I was trying to speak Spanish in front of these Mexican girls. And one of them goes, oh, wow, Puerto Ricans really don't know Spanish. And I was like, well, because again, what we're saying is like there was literally a program of stripping Spanish away from Puerto Rican people, right? The education was taught, classes were taught in English, right? Like right away, like beginning in like the first 10 years they instituted this thing, right? And it was institutionalized for a long time, and to be more Americanized. So it's just like the system just wants you to feel completely insecure about who you are and where you come from, and you're not enough. You're not enough to be a part of America. You're not even enough to be a part of where you come from. You're not enough for anything. It's like a way of mentally defeating people so that you can like just take what's theirs, right?
But when you say that these girls were saying, "Oh wow, Puerto Ricans really don't know Spanish," it's also part of what our job is, both in Latino studies and in heritage programs, is to really educate different generations as to what this means. Part of my research had to do with when I was interviewing these Mexican immigrant and a lot of Mexican immigrant men who'd come to New Mexico in their teens or as adults and married Chicanas from northern New Mexico. When I would be speaking with them, they'd feel more comfortable to do the interviews in Spanish, and they'd say, "Oh, okay, yeah, no eres como los otros Nuevo Mexicanos or los otros Chicanos, tú sí hablas bien." And I was like, wow. So there's this sense of educating. Well, let me tell you the history as to what's happened here. And let's think about your grandkids and your great grandkids. Will you be telling them that? Because there's a sense of, I'm first or second generation, meaning I arrived as an adult to the US, or my parents did. So I have this real close relationship to the language. I can't even understand how you could be separated from the language, right? But
a big percentage of Latinos in the United States are like 40, 30, 35% weren't born here?
Exactly. I mean, most Latinos in the U.S. were not born here.
Oh, really?
Wow. And the term Latino itself was born in the U.S., right? It's that term didn't have any type of significance outside.
People in Mexico don't consider themselves. People south of the border don't consider themselves Latino.
You're Mexicano, or you're Sonorense, or you're Chihuahuense, or you're, but the idea that we need to educate each other because we've been separated from each other's histories. Mexicanos don't, also are deprived of knowing what happened to that other half of their country and the people who were there and their descendants, and then what happens when they now come here. Like, why? Some of the people that I interviewed were like, yeah, I thought when I came here from Chihuahua, it was all going to be, puros güeritos, puros, just Anglos.
Yeah.
Like, that's not understanding that we are a Latino country and the histories of those struggles. The same thing with Chicago. When I would talk to families in Chicago, they're like, yeah, I didn't know I was coming to like such a Latino city. This myth is on both sides, where both those who are immigrating and those who are from here are so separated from each other's histories, and the ways that whiteness and English are kind of the ideology of what's ideal, right? Of what American is. Yeah. So it's redefining American, what the
it's America's brand. It's the brand that it creates for itself, but it's not true, right?
Exactly. I mean, when we were more brown people than not.
Yeah, so I mean, it's that's an interesting point that like people like say New Mexicans can go to Mexico, cross the border, and they'll be looked down as less than for just being on the side of Mexico that got conquered. Like, how is it your fault, right? How is it what would happen to you if Chihuahua had been conquered too? People in Chihuahua would be in the same boat, right?
And the ways that border has been really reinforced in recent years as being this thing that it wasn't, 100 years ago. It was so much more fluid, and there was not this policing in ways of who can come over and who can't. If we need you, come over. We need you for work. We need braceros, come over. We don't need you anymore. We'll deport you. This back and forth has been happening for a while, but the ways that the border's been talked about in the last 20 years is very different from how it was talked about, in the first 50 years of this country, of the Southwest being part of, or the northern part of Mexico becoming the Southwest of the U.S.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all of that's, it all plays a part in these discussions around language and identity. And
I mean, Gore Vidal called America the United States of amnesia. And like, my whole thing is like, they have to teach history, or there has to be a culture of like history, of knowing history. Cause it's like, everybody watches shows, right? Everybody watches these shows that are like 5 seasons, and they're called these like long movies now, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to jump into a show in the 3rd season and understand what's going on. What is your friend going to tell you? No, you got to go back to the beginning and start. Binge watch it this weekend. That's what people have to do with American history. Binge American history so you know what's going on now. Because because, you know, like you're saying, people are talking about the border like it's always been this line in the sand that every bold, and no, it was this fluid thing. And nobody even thought of the border until like being Latino became hyper politicized very, very recently.
And and when you're talking about the history, I love that idea of looking at it as seasons. Like you got to start with season 1, but you also got to make sure you're watching the season by the writers that are giving you, you know, the stories that are from.
You just took my analogy and
right?
improved it. Yeah, that's good. I like that.
I'm trying to think, how can I say this? But I mean, yeah, because people could say, yeah, I took history, but I never learned about the Tulsa massacre. You know, I took history. I never learned about these really important things. I just learned recently that my great grandpa's brother was lynched in Belen, New Mexico. Like, I didn't even know this. You know, we have these histories that we don't know about that aren't being told. So who's telling history and whose voices are we listening to? Like, I totally agree with you. Just making sure that we're having the voices of the all communities there.
And the other hard thing about, you know, a program like, you know, Spanish for Heritage Learners or Heritage Speakers or Heritage Spanish, you know, you can say anything. Yeah. I know this from experience. You know, my dad left. He's a Puerto Rican, so my dad left the family. I was raised Honduran Puerto Rican because we grew up in Humboldt Park, Logan Square. It's a weird mix. Your grandma in Chicago, is she Honduran? She's Honduran. My mom was born in Honduras, but like I had, you know, they grew up in Humboldt Park, so my youngest aunt talks with a Puerto Rican. She talks Puerto Rican. My mom can switch. And they all say vos, right? But my mom can switch between Honduran and Puerto Rican Spanish, which is, you know, that sounds controversial, but it's a thing. If you're Latino, you know. And this is kind of the point I'm getting to. And my oldest aunt talks Mexican Spanish. And so what my grandma also might be, you know, she's one of these, you know, nationalistic kind of immigrants, you know, like Mexicans are another thing, you know? And so like, I just wrote about how she wouldn't let me make tacos out of tortillas because she's like, we don't do that. I was reading that. I read that. And that made me think of the way that, when I would take my students to Nicaragua, I felt like there was a different way of approaching the tortilla. Yeah. She just didn't like us she's like, we don't do that with tortillas. We roll them. Or like if I say no manches or órale güey, she hates that, right? She's like, no, we don't talk like that. We don't talk like that, right? So that's the other added difficulty I see in a program like the one you're ahead of, you know, you're leading, is that, you know, Spanish is such a wide thing, you know. Spanish, Argentines. I dated an Argentine woman, and you know, she would say torta, and torta meant something very different to her, you know, than it meant to me. And so, I mean, do you ever run across that, like people in your class saying, "Well, no, when I was growing up, or my parents say this, or my grandma says this," and it means something completely different? I feel like that did happen more in Chicago because there's just a lot more Latino diversity in Chicago, right? So, I mean, the typical Mexican, you know, the two largest Latino populations in Chicago, kind of that was something that we would come across more there. But I mean, it happened in New Mexico all the time, particularly between Nuevo Mexicanos and Mexicanos. So you understanding like, okay, like there were different ways that we said things, but it's always getting at this issue, but it's not a right or wrong, right? It's just different. Yeah. And because people will build those hierarchies in the ways that your grandma's like, no, we don't talk like that. I remember even after I had been in DC for a while and a lot of my friends were Puerto Rican, and I came back and I can't remember what I said, but I said it in a way that my dad was like, don't talk like that. And I said, why? He goes, we don't talk like that here. And so it happens. And there's these ways of saying, no, but this is who we are. And it's a way of, you know, we define who we are by what we're not. So if you can't, that's what my dad would tell me, like, you know, in the ways that we would talk about our differences between Mexicans who came from the nation of Mexico and no Mexicanos who are from New Mexico. Like, well, the best way to go about it is thinking about, well, how do you kind of exclude yourself from certain things? How do you define what you're not? And then you're defining what you are. So that kind of way of looking at language, it's kind of, we don't say it that way. Here in Arizona, I feel like it's a bit more homogeneous because look, everything very much, Southern Arizona is just an extension of Sonora in many ways. The ways that, you know, most of my students have Tucson, family, right? In Sonora. Yes. Most of my students have family in Sonora or have been in Tucson for a really long time, but the original roots were Sonora.
everything Mexican here is really Sonora, which is interesting because my partner, who's Guanajuato and Chicago Mexican, he's like, this is not the Mexican I know. This is a very different Mexican, both in the ways that you speak, you know, the dialect is a little different, and you can tell like different ways of pronouncing things, the muchacho versus muchacho type of thing.
Oh yeah, the Chihuahua. Like I said, my wife's Chihuahuan, so they say leche. You know,
leche. Yeah, and actually that's something that my uncle in New Mexico, he works in construction. He's an engineer, and he works with a lot of his workers are from Chihuahua. And when he starts saying muchacho, my dad will be like, why are you doing that? We are not from Chihuahua. So there's ways that you police your family, you police your communities, you police. You use linguistic policing as a way to assert who you are and who you're not. I think in the classroom that can play out in really beautiful ways because you're really making students think critically about the beliefs they have about language, because that's what ideologies are, right? They're so ingrained that you don't stop and step outside of them to say, oh, this is an ideology. It's not just the way things are. This is actually a belief that my community has, but maybe other communities don't. So that I think is what's beautiful about having that type of diversity in the classroom, that you can question it. And even that works its way out also in Spanglish and in ways of the ways that you mix English with Spanish. Maybe there's not a lot of variation in the type of Spanish that's spoken between the students' families. They're all from Sonora. Okay. But between the generations, I might start saying, use a loan word for a verb that's taking an English word and making it into a Spanish verb. And that's what we use. So there's that type of variation too, saying, oh, you know what, there's actually a structure to this. Spanglish isn't random. It's got a structure. It's using grammar from both, so that you have that type of variation that you can also look critically at and our beliefs around why is it such a problem for these two languages to mix.
Before I get to my Tucson story, I just want to say, like that my wife's Mexican, born in Juarez, grew up speaking Spanish. Was in ESL when she first started. She came when she was 2, but when she started school, she had to take ESL. So now she talks. She'll talk Puerto Rican Spanish, and she says because it's fun. It's more fun,
Fun.
So it's interesting having our it's a Latino relationship, but. And so to a non-Latino, they think, oh, well, you guys have the same culture. And no, we don't. She's teaching me things about Latino culture that I had no idea. And I'm teaching her things. Like I made her plátano maduro one time, the first time she ever had it. And I'm seeing, I made her eggs, plátano maduro, crema, which we call mantequilla in Honduras, frijoles and plátano maduro. And she's eating everything. And she's not eating the plátano maduro, right? And I'm like, what are you doing? And she goes, no, I'm saving it's dessert, right? I'm saving it for dessert. I'm like, no, you eat it all together. She goes, oh, the Tucson story is like, we fixed my suegro's papers. And I say, this is interesting. I'm not a Spanish speaker, right? But I say suegro a lot, even in my writing, because I like it better than father-in-law. It just feels better to say and to use. So it's interesting how language is like that. But, we had just fixed his papers and, he's in El Paso, come live with us in Vegas, And so we drove down to El Paso to pick him up, and he's coming to Vegas, and he's been out of the country for 14 years, and he's excited. And we stop in Tucson. We stop at this really hipster place. You probably know it. It's like it's a restaurant, but it has like an outdoor place where there's all these trees in the middle, and it's like all these lights, and it's a Mexican place. And but I don't think anybody there is Mexican who works there. It's all, everybody has gauges and stuff like that in their ears. And he orders a chile relleno, right? And the chile that they brought was like my pinky. And he just looks, this guy who's been out of the country, he's excited to be back. And he sees this chile relleno, and it's just the smallest thing. And it's just funny. We laugh about, like, no offense, but now, Tucson, how he says it. Tucson is kind of like a punchline in our joke. Oh, vamos a Tucson. But anyways,
it's not. I mean, I appreciate Tucson on many levels, but it's not my home either. So I mean, I'm very I appreciate a lot of things, but I'm still learning a lot of things. I feel like I'm still on a learning curve here that has been interesting because I felt an almost immediate connection with Latino communities in Chicago, and I still feels like a home to me. And I go a lot, and I'm still connected in many ways. but Tucson's been a challenge, and I don't know. Maybe if it's because of the proximity to New Mexico that there's this feeling like, oh, but I'm so close to home, but this is different. This isn't home.
It's
or
very
something.
different, right?
Yeah, I mean, aside from politics and all that, just having that real palatable connection to Sonora, like that's very different. We border with Chihuahua and New Mexico, but we don't have that in the same way that I feel like Southern Arizona has. And Phoenix is its own thing. So I can't speak to Phoenix, even though it's only 90 minutes away from Tucson.
But it's like a city, right? It's like, I think it's even bigger
I mean,
than
the
Vegas.
economy is way different, and you have a lot more diversity of Latinos in Phoenix for sure.
What I learned about Tucson is like, I mean, I grew up in American culture, so Tucson was like, when I was a kid, Tucson was like the Wild West, right? I imagine people with spurs and horses, and the only thing I knew about Albuquerque was when Bugs Bunny would poke out of the hole. I must have made a wrong turn at Albuquerque. That's the only thing I knew about Albuquerque. Albuquerque was out by where the cactuses are. That's all I knew as a kid from Chicago, right?
At least you knew of it. I feel like a lot of people don't even know. And if they know now, it's because of Breaking Bad.
Yeah. I mean, did that... Do you ever hear stupid shit about that? Like with people, oh, you're from Albuquerque, or do you do meth?
Much. And what's interesting
is there a meth thing? And is there a meth problem, or was there a meth problem in Albuquerque?
Yeah, I do remember in high school and undergrad there were a lot of meth houses blowing up in town. But I feel like the production of meth. My sister can probably speak better to this because she's an attorney and she's a criminal defense attorney. But she's mentioned to me, and I guess it is the reality that a lot of the meth production is not happening in the city anymore. So when Breaking Bad started filming, I feel like it was around 2007, 2008 or something. So I remember the show premiering when I was still a couple years into my stay in Chicago, that I feel like that reality had passed a few years before already. Like, so it was out of date in that way. But I mean, Albuquerque has a lot of challenges. Proportionally, it has a similar crime rate to Chicago, and we have a lot of drug issues.
One of the poorest states in the union, right?
One of the poorest states. This crazy dichotomy between, we have like one of the largest concentrations of millionaires in Los Alamos, right? Because all the scientists that came, bordering one of the poorest counties in the country, Rio Arriba County. So like you have this disparity.
Half of Navajo Nation is in there, right? And
the
Navajo Nation suffers a lot, right?
Yeah. So you have all these disparities. I mean, Albuquerque is challenged in many ways, as larger cities, as many cities are, right? I just think there's this sense that crime or things like this these challenges only exist in big cities. Well, no, we have these challenges as well. But as far as the meth, I do feel like the production of it and it being in the news a lot in Albuquerque itself was more early 2000s, late 90s, and then it's kind of moved out either to across the border or just to more rural areas.
I think they probably picked New Mexico. I mean, it was happening there, right? But like you're saying, it was happening in Illinois. It's happening everywhere, right?
Exactly.
But New Mexico is so beautiful, and it's probably just a great place to film, right?
There was a great relationship with the Breaking Bad production teams and the cast over the years with Albuquerque. I mean, I remember friends of mine at the University of New Mexico being, extras. It was kind of like when Chicago Fire started filming around UIC. I feel like there was a pretty good relationship there as well. But I feel like everybody really appreciated Albuquerque, who was working there from Breaking Bad. And even when they wrapped it all up, I remember there being a billboard saying, "Thank you, Albuquerque. We had great chemistry." And it was, it was true. Like it was a really nice experience because there had been I can't remember specifics, but I just remember other stars before New Mexico and Albuquerque became more of a center for filming, because Netflix is filming a ton of things now in New Mexico, and they have an agreement with the state for that. But I feel like there was a lot of disparaging that would happen sometimes when people were filming in New Mexico or in Albuquerque. So I think we appreciated that. But as far as I don't know the history between the selection of Albuquerque, but I mean, we appreciate it.
I mean, and this is going back to the very beginning of our discussion. I mean, you talked about, is it Taos? I mean, that people talk about Taos like it's holy. I mean, we passed through, and there's a lot of famous people who live there too, like celebrities who live there, and they don't like to say that they live there because it's like a peaceful community, right? I mean, what is
there's a lot of famous people in northern New Mexico. It's gorgeous, and they can afford it because it's cheap for them.
That's the interesting thing about New Mexico is that there's so many different landscapes. I mean, especially coming from Illinois, where it's pretty homogenous. You come down in the north, it's all mountains and woods and lakes and rivers, and then there's a beautiful, like there's a desert in southern Mexico, but it's not like the desert in Arizona, which gets boring. It's beautiful desert, right?
The high desert, our elevation's high, right? So, Albuquerque is the same elevation as Denver, or near it.
Really?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's why people are like, oh, you get snow in New Mexico? Like, yes, the Rocky Mountains run through half of the state. So, we have all of that. As far as Taos goes, my grandma's from Taos. My grandma, my dad's mom, Virginia Montoya de Gorman, and she I feel like Taos is interesting. I don't know the history of Taos as far as that sense of it being magical. And I know that there was a lot of hippies who moved into Taos in the 60s, a lot. I have cousins who, remember all these kids going to school that were like kids of people who were living, in communes and not bathing. Because I remember my cousin saying, yeah, we could always tell who these white hippies, the kids of the white hippies, right? Because they kind of smelled, and they would get into a lot of fights with the Chicano kids who's, and the thing about northern New Mexico is the majority is Hispanic. So if you move in and you're Anglo, you generally will kind of assimilate into that, or you're gonna have kind of choques with the culture, but that is the dominant culture. And you have Taos with that kind of history of, there's still a hippie commune in the mountains up there. I remember for a class in undergrad, we went up there for this course I was taking, and I didn't even know it existed. Like, there's this whole parallel life of magical things happening there. In Taos, there's a Hindu temple, there's a Buddhist temple nearby. It just has attracted a lot of different faiths, and they say the sky is magical, the mountains are magical. I mean, my grandma grew up between El Prado and Ranchos de Taos, which are two suburbs of Taos, and small outside areas, and it was just a place where you had your land and you worked the land. My great grandma had her farm and a dairy, and the pueblo is right nearby as well. So you had the Pueblo reservation there. Although my great grandma had like a best friend who was from the Pueblo, but there wasn't a whole lot of interaction going on. My grandma talks about her, some of the men from the Pueblo helping them with their land and things like that. But yeah, I've only spent time in Taos when I take my grandma, because she moved to Santa Fe when she was 18 or 19, and my great grandma wanted her to stop seeing a guy she was seeing in Taos. So my grandma's grandma, Eliza Montoya, was very political. And so she walked into the governor's office in Santa Fe and said, give my granddaughter a job. So she got a state job in Santa Fe and never went back to Taos. But I go with her when we just take visits up to, when we still had a lot of family that were like her aunts and uncles and my great grandma and my great grandma's sister, and just being able to visit them. But a lot of the land that, I think Donald Rumsfeld bought one of the properties that was in our family at some point. I think Julia Roberts has property up there.
Yeah, Julia Roberts, a lot of celebrities, right? Like actors find out about it, and I mean, it's beautiful. If anybody listening, watching, like the drive from, right when you come through from Raton, right? And you go west through Cimarron Canyon, down, Eagle's Nest, down to Taos, Rancho Taos, and then it's just getting dusk, and we hit Santa Fe, coming from the north. And Santa Fe was, I mean, it's almost like magical, right? It's in these hills, and it's Santa Fe, and it's old, and it's cultural, and it's not trying to. Oh, so many places now are trying to be like everywhere else, or are like becoming like everywhere else, right? But Santa Fe feels like, I mean, we went to the church, and you see like the piece of the true cross, apparently, or stuff from, Mary and stuff like that. It's like, it's so crazy. And I'm not religious, but it's like, there's something really special, especially about, I want to go to the, like the bombing sites and stuff like that. I want to go to Los Alamos and the other thing I wanted to say was that, you were talking about how people get surprised that there's, it's United States is pretty Latino,
Yeah.
I was driving around with my suegro, and he's like looking at here in Vegas, and he's looking at all the street signs. And he's like, all the street signs are in Spanish. I'm like, yeah. He's like, and it almost relieved him, I think. He didn't say anything like that, but it made him feel like, oh, like I'm not in this strange land. Like, oh, this is all. You see that it's all political. That the lines are just fake, right? The borders are fake.
Yeah.
The Nevada's a state and Arizona's a state. That's all new. But like this land and I always talk to them about the Indians that were here, you know, and the over here it's the Paiutes and but anyways, I mean, is there anything else we can touch on? I mean, we kind of hit it all, man.
Yeah, there's a lot. You and I can always talk for a really long time.
Yeah.
We need to do that more because it's been a while.
Yeah, for sure.
No, nothing in particular. I am curious. Are you do you miss Chicago, or have you adjusted well to Nevada? I feel like when you're from Chicago, you like it's in you and you ache for it.
I'm a Chicagoan forever.
Yeah.
I'm a Chicagoan. Like you're a Nuevo Mexicana. I'm a Chicagoan. And I, you know, even in my bio, I've been living here for 4 years now. And I say I'm a Chicago writer living in Vegas. And I'll always say that wherever I'm at, if I'm 60 and I'm in Spain or something, or if I'm in China, I'm a Chicago writer living in China. Because that's just, it forms just the way I talk. I feel like Chicago, a place has culture, especially not a lot of places have culture, but some places do, like New Mexico, California, New York, Chicago. And I always find that, you know, people out here are so weird and they're slow and they're not polite and they don't know about social etiquette. And whenever I meet somebody who's really nice and really easy to talk to, like I talk to everybody, first of all, right? And whenever I meet somebody who's really easy to talk to, oh yeah, I'm from Milwaukee. Oh yeah, I'm from Gary. Oh, I'm from Detroit. I'm like, of course you're from the Midwest. Like, but yeah, I miss Chicago. I miss the people. There's no culture in Vegas. It's like you're living in the parking lot of Disney World, you know? Disney World's awesome. The Strip is awesome. And it's entertainment capital of the world, right? But the place around it, and people from Vegas who are going to hear this and say, yeah, there's culture here. Yeah. The food here is terrible. It's not like food in Chicago where you can find, if you here you have to go hunting for food, right? Chicago, just go to the corner. Go to the place on the corner. It's going to be bomb as hell. Whatever they're selling, Pakistani, Mexican, Puerto Rican, whatever it is going to be bomb as hell. I miss the winters. There's something about, like, I moved. Our main reason for moving was my wife's work, and we didn't want winters anymore.
Oh, okay.
But there's something about going through that winter every year, and everybody's eating shit for those 4 months, and we're all struggling. And when the summer hits, when May hits in Chicago, there's nothing like that feeling. When it's Memorial Day weekend in Chicago or 4th of July weekend in Chicago, there's nothing like that feeling in a city like there is. Like, you don't have that here. We don't do seasons in Vegas. There's no Halloween. There's no Thanksgiving. There's no Christmas. There's no nothing.
That's hard for me here. The lack of seasons. I mean, it's a little better than Phoenix, I guess, as far as it being cooler. But I mean, I grew up with 4 seasons, and it's probably because I'm not born and raised in Chicago, but I never had a problem with the winters. I loved them. I thought that, you know, there was just something unifying about it, something kind of special about that. And I was just listening to Michelle Obama's, when I was driving back from New Mexico to here, I was listening to her book, and because I hadn't read it yet. And I thought, well, I might as well just listen to it. The way that she describes, like, in the morning, hearing, you know, really early, the people cleaning off their windshields, like that sound, it's just so real. Like, oh yeah, you're right. Like, yeah, it's 3 a.m, somebody's going to work. And she described the winters in a way that I was like, yes. And I'm not from there, but I mean, it's
that is the sound of a winter morning in Chicago. Not birds, right? It's
exactly.
And it's so you're not even put off by it after a while. You know, you're just like, oh, that's just the sound of the morning. And that's why I like Michelle Obama, because she's really from Chicago. Obama claimed Chicago, and there's all this different stuff. Like, Michelle taught him how to speak. He doesn't know how to speak. He's not that friendly. He's not that sociable. She's the powerhouse. She's smart. She's a people person. She's from Chicago, for real.
Yeah, I haven't finished it because I drove 6 hours.
My wife's been reading it, but I didn't read it yet.
I enjoy hearing the audiobook because she's narrating it. So I enjoyed that. But I just love hearing about her growing up in South Shore and what her reality was. And, you know.
You think she's going to run?
No.
She didn't want him running, right? She didn't want him in politics.
I'm just at the portion. I mean, she said that, I guess. But, I mean, she accepted him for kind of the unexpected trajectory she knew he was going to be on, because that kind of attracted her to him. But I feel like she's made it clear that's not she doesn't like being in the public. Like, there's a great scene that she talks about where she was really good friends with Jesse Jackson's daughter, and they would end up at political things unexpectedly, and she ended up walking in the Bud Billiken parade and didn't want to be in the Bud Billiken parade, but ended up in it. And her mom sees her on TV, and when she gets home, she's like, I knew you didn't want to be there. And that type of thing, like she just didn't like that, like to be in the center. And she does it very well, but it seems like it was
very well. Like if she were to run, I mean, I think she'd run away with the nomination, and she would win. Because even people who don't like Democrats, don't like the Democratic Party or politics, Republican, Democrat, people on both sides don't like it. People liked her, right? I mean, she left office, she left the White House with like an 85% approval rating. Like the whole country loved her.
When I look at the success of her book, I mean, she was before, obviously pre-pandemic, on all these tours for it and everything. Yeah, no, I love hearing her talk about her Chicago, right? Her pride in being from the south side of Chicago.
Well, it was really good talking to you. I mean, let people know where they can. Are you on social media a lot, or I mean, do you?
I need to be more. I mean,
no, you don't. You don't. I mean, I wish I'm in media, so I have to be. Like, if you're not on social media, social media is media now, right?
It is, and it's kind of indispensable. I mean, we have it for our Spanish as a Heritage Language program at University of Arizona. We have Instagram and Facebook and
what are the handles for that? I
don't even know. I need to look it up. I'm at the University of Arizona. I'm an assistant professor and the director of Spanish as a Heritage Language. And, I guess you can reach, this sounds so old. You can reach me at my email.
Telegraph.
Yeah, exactly. Send me a letter. It's UASHLP, I believe, is the handle for Instagram. And then it's just University of Arizona Spanish as a Heritage Language program. Just search that. But yeah, I need to get more on the social media and having more of a web presence.
No, you don't. I mean, it sucks. It really sucks.
It's just so many things you need to do for promoting yourself and your work at the same time trying to get your work done and get tenure and work in the community. I mean,
I can't imagine being a professor and trying to keep, working on a book and all that stuff. Like, because you're just not, social media, there's this whole culture of like being present. Right. And social media is anti that, not being present, right?
Exactly.
Oh, this is a moment that I can put on social media, so that pulls you out of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you post it, or once you even just take a picture, you're out of it. It's gone, and that's life. Those little fleeting moments, that's life. Life is lived like in a split second,
But there's this pressure to be documenting all of it, right? To show that you have this presence and to show that you're doing all these things. And it's a lot, because the important things like working with students one-on-one, mentoring them, or you having the time to really think about your own work, or I don't know, I spend a lot of time making sure I have time to spend with my parents and my grandparents. Like, those are the things you don't want to be, or to keep.
Nobody wants to see that either. So like,
and you don't want it, and you don't want to be documenting that in that way, because it is that special. So it's a tension that I have with all of that. But to a certain extent, there's just this kind of, what would you call it? Just this need to professionalize students, and you kind of having this, my students have signatures, like when they're as undergrads, they're like, their name and their major and their like where they work. And I'm like, wow, I wouldn't even have thought of that when I was an undergrad. I made fun of a really good friend of mine who had business cards. I remember when he was in. So it's just that pressure, I think, is there, and you're expected to have all of that plus the normal things like that you need to keep your job, like running your program.
But it's bullshit. Like, it's all about appearance, right? You're supposed to look professional. It doesn't really even matter if you are professional, if you know your shit, if you're good at your work, if you work hard. It doesn't really matter, because we know people who, everybody knows them because they look professional and wow, that person's really doing it. But you know them personally, like they're not a good scholar, they're not really doing the work, and it sucks that those people get that reputation while you're grinding in the dark and you don't have that reputation, or don't have the reputation that they have.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. And I don't know, I just feel like I took a cue from one of my big mentors, Frances, in Chicago at UIC, and then she went to Northwestern to direct the Latino Studies program there. Like she wasn't about that. She was about being an amazing mentor and producing amazing Latino Studies scholarship. And so to me, that's like, that speaks for you. And how can you do both? How can you be producing this amazing stuff, but also be maintaining this whole other
something's got to give.
Social media it's really hard.
And why would you sacrifice the work for social media posts? Because I see people who have like, I'm at 1,700 posts, and I've been doing Instagram for a few years, and I see people who have like 5,000 something. I'm like, Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus. But I think that whole culture that, your whole vibe is New Mexico, right? Because that's how New Mexico is, at least in my mind, right? We're not California. We don't want to be California. We don't want to be Arizona. We don't want to be Texas. Tejanos are always like Tejano, 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 New Mexico's very proud of itself. New Mexicans are very proud of their state, where they come from, but they don't telegraph it. And then you go there, and then it's like fucking amazing. There's fucking hot air balloons, and there's beautiful cities and beautiful landscape. And I'm like, why aren't you guys posting this stuff? And you're like, yeah, it's not for the world. It's for us. We know what we have, and that's okay.
Maybe that's the connection I feel so strong with Chicagoans, because I feel like there's this confidence, and we're from Chicago, and we're proud of it.
Yeah,
but we don't,
because we're not New York,
and New York's not New York, exactly.
And we're not going to be New York, and we're like, okay, great, let New York be New York. We know what we got. We got fucking Grant Park, and we got the lake, and we're great. But thank you for coming on. I mean,
thank you, Hector.
I will keep in touch. And,
okay, yes, let's keep in touch.
Keeping on.
Okay.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Peace.